All right. It is. Okay, I think we're going to skip a review because some of you weren't here. And if you didn't hear it last week's, we now have a YouTube channel. You can go to it. It's up there probably already. Last week's Daniel's up there.
Is it under your name?
Yes, it's Dr. Tim Kennedy, YouTube, and we're gonna add all the other teachings, and we've also added all the outlines. We have them on a PDF. It's on the cloud. Joe figured out how to do that. I think it's great that he did it. But all right, so we're in Daniel. We're actually going to try to finish the 7th chapter. The third try to finish the 7th chapter.
Tim, can I interrupt a second? How's Jared?
I think she's doing okay now.
What was the decision? She went to the specialist.
Well, I think the decision was that the specialist didn't give him much direction. I think that's so.
What can they do?
Okay, now let's read. We're going to start here in verse 12, and we're going to try to get through 20. So let's read 12 through 14 first. It says, Daniel 7, says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. And I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is for an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Now, there's actually a lot in here. So let's try to cover a few things. First of all, we know what had just happened, if you were here last week, and that is there's this celestial court that the Ancient of Days, he's called, has, and he sits on that court, and myriads upon myriads of angels are all around his throne. And of course, what he's judging is the 4-beast kingdom. Okay, these 4 beasts that we've talked about, the Babylonian kingdom first, the Medo-Persian kingdom as the 2nd beast, the Greek kingdom as the 3rd beast, and then this 4th beast, which we're going to see, I think, try to see even more so this week, has 2 elements to it. It has 2, if you want, eras to it. The first part of it, of course, is the Roman Empire. But as you look at the language and you look at what's said, you realize that there's got to be something more than just the ancient Roman Empire, and we'll show you why that's true. Now, there's kind of an enigma here. He talks about how he's crushed these beasts and judged them. Then in verse 12, he says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted them for an appointed time. So why does he say that? Seems rather like a contradiction, doesn't it? Well, let me note some things about these previous beasts, okay? First of all, you find in each one of these kingdoms elements or aspects of law, culture, and even language that permeated each one of them and finally, ultimately, into the 4th. Now, also we see the very strong evidence of the third kingdom, that is the Greek culture, what we call Hellenistic culture. It influenced most of the known world, actually, from 332 to around 100 BC. Even the Roman conquest of the Greek Empire, the Romans often wrote in Koine Greek. They studied Greek philosophy. They adopted Greek idols or idolatry practice, and of course copy Greek architecture. So there are very, very strong elements of Greek culture in the Roman culture. They adopted a lot. So you see that even though these beasts are judged and each one of them successfully loses power, there still are elements that carry on and ultimately end up finally in the fourth, especially. Now, it says that after the four-beast kingdom is crushed, which we note here in Daniel 7:11, and the complement in Daniel 2, verses 34 and 44. Remember, we see it, we study this in a different way in the chapter 2 statue, okay, with the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the hips and thighs of bronze, and of course the legs and feet of iron, okay?
That was human view.
That was, as I said, that was the human view of history. Here, in this chapter, all through chapter 7, it is God's view of history, God's view of these empires. Man saw them as these gleaming, this wonderful, literally made by Nebuchadnezzar, 90-foot tall statue of all these beautiful metals. That was Nebuchadnezzar's view. That was mankind's view of man and man's accomplishments. But when God sees it, he sees them as four beasts, each one being progressively worse, really, until the final one, which is so bad.
It's worse or still.
It's worse or still. And he can't even name it with the type of an animal, the fourth beast. It's just called the fourth beast. Now, so we see here that this system is crushed, and it's crushed by a fifth kingdom, which emerges. We saw this in Daniel 2, because what does it say? After the fourth beast kingdom, there is this huge stone which becomes a mountain and crushes all the kingdoms. And of course, who is the stone? The Messiah. Now, I want you to notice something that's really easy to overlook, but I think it's important. I'm going to turn to Matthew 6. And you tell me if we don't overlook this. But notice what it says. Okay? This is, quote, the Lord's Prayer. Okay? So let me start at verse 9. Pray then in this way. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Verse 10. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what does that tell you?
His will in heaven is already done.
That's partly true.
But it's coming, his kingdom is coming to earth then.
Exactly. See, his kingdom is already in heaven. And when Christ came the first time, he, of course, brought this spiritual kingdom into existence. Okay? Brought the spiritual church into existence. But he didn't bring a physical kingdom. Matter of fact, when they tried to make him king, what did he do? He rejected it. No, this is not the time. So when we keep praying the Lord's Prayer, we're praying for this kingdom to come. In other words, Lord, please come back and start your 1,000-year reign on this earth. That's what we're saying. We often don't think of it that way. But that's exactly what we're saying.
I think that way every time I pray.
You do. Very good. Okay. Now, back in the 7th chapter of Daniel, notice it says, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. Now, we see all kinds of allusions of clouds in connection with Christ. All right?
He went up in a cloud.
He, in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, he's going to come back in a cloud. Okay? When he ascended from this earth back into heaven, it was in a cloud. And even during his ministry, He has this very unique experience
Yeah.
in the 17th chapter of Matthew we record, where he shows up with two other guys on the mountaintop, being Moses and Elijah, and they are surrounded in a
Cloud.
cloud. Okay? So there are many, many, many references to Christ being connected to the clouds.
Well, the cloud, in Egypt, when
Exactly.
he was leading the people.
Cloud by day, fire by night. Exactly. And he is also the light of the world. Now, so it says that the Ancient of Days hands this kingdom to the Son of Man.
Mhm.
This is a clear allusion to Messiah. Let me show you just a couple examples, okay? Go back to Matthew again. Go to Matthew 8 this time. Matthew 8. I want to show you just here in Matthew, just a few examples. Go to 8:20. Matthew 8:20. And Jesus said to him, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So who's he speaking of? Himself. He calls himself the Son of Man. So go to the next chapter, go to chapter 9, and look at verse 6. But in order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority over earth to forgive sins, and of course he then does the miracle of curing this paralytic. And then a little bit further, we go to 10:23, Matthew 10:23. Speaking of this time of the end of days, he says, and wherever they persecute you in the city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. In other words, comes back. So, he's identifying himself as being the Son of Man. He's also identifying himself as the one who returns to the earth. So it's pretty clear we're talking about Messiah here. Now, this title, Son of Man, by the way, is used 84 times in the New Testament. It's a very, very common term that Jesus used for himself. We also see it, since you're in Matthew, go to Matthew 24. There's another reference to it here that I think is interesting. Because this is talking about his return. The sign of his return. Starting verse 29 of Matthew 24. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give forth its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the, again, clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So there's going to be a special sign when Christ also returns. Okay? It will literally be a sign of some sort in the heavens, so that in a 24-hour period of time, everyone on the whole earth will see it and know. See, he is coming. Now, we also see that in this coronation by the Ancient of Days of Messiah, that is, Ancient of Days being the Father God, it will be a kingdom covering the whole earth. Turn back to the book of Psalms and go to the early part, go to chapter 2. Psalm 2. So in Psalm 2, we're going to read verses 6, 7, and 8. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain, and I will surely tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, Thou art my son, So who is it that's being installed? Jesus, the Son. Okay. Today I have begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thy inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as thy possession. See the point? Worldwide rule of Christ on the earth.
Because Satan has ruled right now.
He does now, and he's going to be dispossessed at that point. Now, in other words, this is not speaking about a spiritual kingdom. This is speaking about a literal kingdom, a physical kingdom that will occur at the time of the return of Christ to this earth. That kingdom, of course, will be how long? 1,000 years. We have many, 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 many verses, especially in Isaiah, telling us it will be 1,000-year reign, and it will be a unique type of kingdom, okay, with Messiah reigning. It will involve the administration of justice. It says that he'll rule with a rod of iron. The nature of things will change. There will not be the level of disease. We see in Isaiah tells us that someone, if they die at 100 years of age, will be considered a young man in this 1,000-year kingdom. Disease will be less. The length of life will be lengthened, though people will still die. Okay? But it will be different with Christ on the earth. And there won't be any, for 1,000 years, war. None. Nada. Okay? You get out of line, you're in big trouble.
And people would not have choice rather than actually worship.
No, they'll have a choice not to worship.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Well, because what happens at the end of the time, at the end of 1,000 years?
Yeah, that's true.
What does Satan do? He's released and he does what he's so good at.
Yeah, pages what is his own.
He stirs up the nations, he creates a rebellion, and they have another conflict with Messiah. Okay? So, now,
At which point of history then you said that every knee will bow down like everyone?
well, during that time, there will be a presence of Messiah on the earth, and there will be an obligation. Every nation will very clearly know who he is and will have to be subservient to him. He now rules the nations of the earth. They don't really rule themselves in that sense.
But still will be people who will choose to not.
Yes, there will be. There will be. But at the same time, there'll be a huge constraint on sinfulness and on a lot of things. All right? So,
This comes after the tribulation.
Tim,
This is
those that don't bow down or worship him during that 1,000 years, are they the ones that are born? Because the ones that go into the millennium.
well, we know that there are some groups of people that go into the millennium. We know that, for instance, those Jews that survive, which I'm going to talk about tonight, will go into the millennium. Undoubtedly,
Will they be believers at that point?
yes, they will. They will, because at the very end, we'll read Zechariah here. They say, "This is the one that was pierced. This is our Messiah."
Right.
Okay, but 2/3 of them will literally die at the hand of Antichrist because they don't accept him.
Yeah, but that's before the millennium.
That's before the millennium. That's just before his return.
Right.
Okay, I think there's going to be those that are not Jews that survive the tribulation. Okay, that will also go into the millennial age.
Believers and non-believers.
Well, I certainly would hope to think that, and I'll talk about that a little bit, that by this time the rapture of the church has occurred, and everyone that at least up till that point that is a believer will be taken out.
Right.
How can they go through the tribulation and God and Jesus return, and they still don't believe?
Well, but they think of all we've studied Revelation a couple of years ago. Think of all the plagues that go on and all the judgments that go on, and there's a perpetual, constant resistance to repent.
Mhm.
Okay? They won't repent. There's going to be a huge number of people, no matter what you do. They are so influenced by Satan. They are so influenced by the satanic kingdom that he sets up. And that especially the last 3.5 years, which we can talk about here in a minute, that they do not believe. They will not believe. They refuse to believe.
There you go. They will not.
Yes. They choose not to.
But they will still go into the 1,000-year reign.
If whoever survives will go in.
Okay.
Now, I also want to show you, since we're in Psalm 2, turn over just a few chapters to right to Psalm 24. Psalm 24, we're going to read verses 7 through 10. It's interesting because if you notice, the psalm starts in Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. Okay? Do you know any other way to interpret that verse? Okay? He is back. It's his. The Ancient of Days has given it to him. Okay? Now drop down to verses 7 through 10. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. He's entered back into the earth. Okay? He says, who is the King of glory? He is the Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? He's the Lord of hosts. He's the King of glory. So, is the Messiah. So, the beginning of this fifth kingdom, though, cannot occur until the end of the final stages of the fourth. And that ends, of course, with the return of Christ to the earth in Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 16. Okay? Now, I was going to do something here, if I can do it quickly. I want you to listen to this. It's called Jesus Shall Reign. You know it? It's speaking of the 1,000-year reign, written by Isaac Watts. that's about the millennium.
Beautiful.
In the song, beautiful?
Beautiful.
Okay. Now, let's go on in Daniel and cover verses 15 and 16. Daniel 7. So let's read it first. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions of my mind kept alarming me. I approached one of those who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Now, who do you suppose these, quote, individuals standing by are? Angels. Because we just read in here, back in verse 9 and 10, okay, that thousands upon thousands were attending him and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. So there's this huge number of angels around this throne, okay? And he turns to one of them and asks him to help him understand what he's been seeing. Now, I think it would be an understatement to say that this entire vision disturbed Daniel.
Yeah.
Okay?
Bother me.
Talk about seeing an unbelievable thing, you know. It really shook him up. As a matter of fact, when it says Daniel felt disturbed, in the Aramaic, it means his spirit was pierced by what he saw. It alarmed him. The word alarmed in Aramaic is the word behar, and it means to be stirred, troubled, or frightened. So, you know, this is a very complex, panoramic vision that he's shown, and it's very difficult for him to take it all in. So this angel, who's undoubtedly one of the myriads upon myriads around the throne, is approached to help explain what he's seeing there. Now, we see this pattern of angels helping to interpret in several other places in the book of Daniel. We'll get there, but looking at them quickly, I just want you to see it becomes a pattern here. To go to the next chapter, and that's chapter 8, verse 16. Daniel 8:16 says, "And I heard the voice of a man, quote, between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision." Okay? So one, actually, angel is calling out Gabriel, and Gabriel's coming to help him interpret this. Also in 9:21, Daniel 9:21, we see it again. It says, "While I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, who I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weakness about the time of the evening offering." Again, helps him understand this vision that he sees. So, we also see this pattern. We don't have to turn to it, but we see this pattern also in the book of Revelation. John has exactly the same experience multiple times, and especially in Revelation 21:9, where an angel takes him aside to explain to John what's going on. Now, you don't have to turn here necessarily if you don't want to, but I'm going to read you out of the book of James, chapter 1, because I think it's important to keep this in mind. Even though Daniel is being shown a very difficult and complex vision, he's being shown information and things that are literally hundreds of years ahead of where he's living. We still see this theme through the scripture. I think it's said well here in James 1, verse 5. "But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him." Remember Amos 3:7 says, God does nothing until first he warns the people through his prophets. Okay? God wants to explain. I find it so interesting, I'll put that word, say interesting, that people will look at the book of Revelation and other prophecies and they'll say, well, there's no way to understand it. Well, yes, there is. If you understand the images and the symbols that start literally in the book of Genesis, okay, you'll see them in Revelation. They're all there. They're all explained. You just have to know where they are. The interpretation's there, you know. So that's why this book is so absolutely fascinating. It's an integrated message from beginning to end. So let's now look back in Daniel at verses 17 and 18. So I'll read. These great beasts, which are four number, are four kings who will arise from the earth. We understand that. We've studied it. But for the saints of the highest one will receive his kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Now, so he explains the beasts, but he adds a very important piece of information that we didn't see previously. So who's going to be helping run and administer this kingdom on earth? The saints. Okay? Now, of course, at this point, there are no New Testament saints, since New Testament hasn't occurred yet. But, of course, in the future kingdom, because there's going to be this future kingdom, remember, this fourth beast has a future in a different form. There will also then be, in the future, New Testament saints. So both the Old Testament and New Testament saints will possess this kingdom. And to show you that, turn to, in the New Testament, to 2 Timothy. I want you to see chapter 2. It's important that we realize these promises. There's some place we're going to be in the future. There are things we're going to be doing there. 2 Timothy 2, verses 11 and 12. It is a trustworthy statement. For if we died with him, we shall also live with him. If we endure, we shall also reign with him. What does that mean? Right. It's a term that means administratively ruling a kingdom. Okay? We shall reign with him. And then he says, if we deny him, he also will deny us. But, you know, which is those that don't believe. But again, we shall reign with him. Also, go back from Timothy in the New Testament to Romans chapter 8. This maybe is one of the clearest statements by Paul. Romans 8, and it's verse 17. He says, if we are his children, or since we are his children, we are heirs also, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, in order that we also may be glorified with him. Okay? In his kingdom. Now, let's move on now back to Daniel, and let's take verses 19 through 22. He says, then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from the other beasts, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder of with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes, and a mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. Now, I'll stop for just a second. I'm going to read a few more verses. But remember, previously, we studied last week, okay, that he was called the little horn. And at first he was inconspicuous. Okay? But then finally gains power and dominion, and of course does what we're talking about here, which we'll talk about. So he says in verse 21, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Now, Daniel further sees a unique understanding about the fourth beast and these, quote, 10 kings, and especially about, quote, the little horn. Now, one thing I want you to remember when we talk about Antichrist, because Antichrist is the little horn, okay? Antichrist in the Greek means two things. It means instead of Christ, and it also means against Christ, okay? And both those things describe the activity of the Antichrist. Now, the little horn, as I said, starts out small, but rapidly grows in power. The angel, again, shares some new information that we didn't have previously, that the little horn finally gains the power to wage war against and overpower, that is temporarily, even the saints. Now, I want you to see, hold your place in Daniel, and I want you to go back to the book of Revelation. One thing that you have to admit in my Bible studies is you sure get to move all around the Bible, don't you?
Yeah.
It's all connected. It's all interconnected. So look at Revelation 13 and verse 7. This is John's version of exactly what we're talking about. Okay? So in 13:7, John's shown, and it was given to him, that is, Antichrist, to make war with saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. So for a time, Antichrist is the ruler of a globalist, that is, worldwide kingdom. He is the top dog. Okay? He has that power, and of course, he attacks God's saints, believers. Now, during this time, of course, it will primarily be Jewish saints. I certainly hope that by this time we're reading here in Revelation 13:7, that the church will be taken out of the world. We can only pray for that. All right? Because we don't know the exact timing, of course, of the rapture. So, I want also you to remember something about what Antichrist does, and I think it's very important. Remember, we studied the book of Zechariah. I think it's one of my favorite Old Testament prophets. So go back to Zechariah. What was it? A couple years ago now we did Zechariah, wasn't it? So go back to the end of Zechariah, to chapter 11, and I want to remind you of something about this person, Antichrist. Zechariah has a unique thing that's shown him prophetically. He has a description of the Antichrist. He also tells us something about the Antichrist in relationship to the Jews. Now, if you remember, the beginning of chapter 11 of Zechariah, and I'm not certainly going to go all through it tonight, but he's talking about these false shepherds that misled Israel, false teachers. They were supposed to shepherd the flock. They didn't do it right. Okay? They stole from the flock. They injured the flock. It said he goes through all these false shepherds. And then he finally goes down to starting in verse 15. And he says, "And the Lord said to me, take again for yourself the equipment of a foolish shepherd." Well, who's this foolish shepherd? Verse 16, "For behold, I'm going to raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for the perishing, seek the scattered, nor heal the broken, or sustain the one standing, but will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves." That is, do exactly what a shepherd shouldn't do. And then he goes on in 17, he says, "Woe to the worthless shepherd," that's what he calls him, "who leaves the flock. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye." Now, that's interesting. Because what does John tell us about Antichrist in the Revelation? Yeah, he'll have a fatal head wound and miraculously be brought back life. And here, even before, Zechariah shows us this. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye. He'll be injured in his head. And his arm will be totally withered, and his right eye will be blind. In other words, Antichrist will have an event where it looks like he's been killed, but then he resurrects. Now, why does he do that, do you suppose? Why?
More will follow him.
Copycat of Messiah.
Exactly, because he's the copycat of Messiah. So he has to have his own false resurrection. Okay? Now, it's interesting, as we go on in Zechariah, that you find, and I'm not going to go into this, but if you remember, I think it's in chapter 14, the Jews literally are being pressed virtually against the Mediterranean Sea. They're being enclosed by their enemies. 2/3 of them have been killed in this last 3.5 year, what we call the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. And at the very moment which it looks like the other third is going to be annihilated, Messiah returns to the earth. And they recognize him. And they accept him. And that third is saved. Okay? Be a very dramatic event. So the point is that Antichrist in the beginning will appear to be the protector of the Jews. But what they don't know, but they will know at the 3.5 year period, is he'll be their worst nightmare. That's why he's called a false shepherd. Okay? Remember, here in the book, we'll go into it, in Daniel chapter 9, you'll see that he makes a treaty with them for 3.5 years. Seems to protect them. Okay? But then, of course, he has always in mind to just annihilate them. And that's what he tries to do. Now, notice back again in these verses, in Daniel chapter 7, he says, he's talking about how Antichrist is able, this little horn, is waging war with the saints and overpowering them. Verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came to pass judgment. So the word until here indicates that this persecution is time limited. And it will abruptly stop at the moment that Messiah returns to the earth again here, we find in Revelation 19:11. Of course, he begins then the millennial kingdom. Now, let's finish this off by reading verses 22 through 28. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will rise, and another will rise after them, and he, that is the 11th, literally, will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings. And he will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half time. For the court will sit for judgment. Remember, here back in the beginning of the chapter, this court sits and judges. The court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away and annihilated and destroyed forever, that is, of Antichrist. Then the sovereignty of the dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the Highest One. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Now, here in these verses, we see that the angel summarizes information about the fourth beast. We know that the fourth beast initially is the Roman Empire. But we also know that there has to be a second version of the fourth beast. So we can think of it as Rome 1 and then Rome 2, okay? A later Rome that occurs in the last 7.5 years of Earth's history. Now, how do we know that it's not Rome 1? Because it says that Rome 2, this empire, will rule the whole earth. Rome 1 didn't rule the whole earth. That's right. Rome 2, that is the later version, will rule the whole earth. So there has to be a second, a revived version that's like the Roman Empire. It, of course, will be ruled by the little horn that grows, the Antichrist, and who will, of course, rule for a time the whole earth. The angel also tells Daniel another piece of information about Antichrist. It's interesting. It says he will attempt to change times and laws. Now, the language in the Aramaic implies changes in religious observances. That's what it seems to imply. Now, he's a dictator. Dictators like to make decisions that are for their best interest and make certain that the masses that they rule, do what they say. Now, we have a lot of examples of this, but one of them came to my mind is an example of what happened in my wife's country. The communists come in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. They take over, okay? They depose the Tsar, they set up a communist system, and one of the things they do is that they end Christmas. Right, dear?
Yeah, they just say there's no God.
Right, because they're atheists. So all of a sudden, in Russia, there's no Christmas anymore. So what they do is they make a secular holiday to replace it, New Year. So in Russia today, if you go, the big celebration is New Year's. Okay? That's the way the communists decided to make changes. Now, we also see similar movements in our culture today, many of them. As a matter of fact, our dear representatives in the House of Representatives have just decided, apparently this week, that their swearing-in oath shall change. They are taking out the words, "So help me God." They've removed them, or they're trying to remove them. They don't want that any longer in the swearing-in oath. Now, we see many examples of this going on in our culture today, where they're taking God out of everything. This is just the latest in many things. Now, I'm suspicious that there's something else going on here also. I can't prove it, but I'm suspicious of it. And that's this. Who, of course, started the idea of times? I'll read it to you. Genesis 1:14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate day from night." There's one time form, 24 hours, day and night. Okay? "Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So God sets up his system of how to mark out time and seasons and the lunar calendar and a solar calendar. All right? So Antichrist, of course, I think can't possibly bear this because he is taking the place and trying to convince the world that he is a god. Okay? So I think it's very likely this is another reason why he changes times. And he's going to set up his own chronology because he certainly can't accept God's. I can't prove that, but I suspect that that's what goes on there. Okay, so to finish this off, there's a mention of a very interesting phrase here that we have to keep in mind. It says that there will be time, times, and half a time. That means there will be 1 year plus 2 years plus a half year. That is the rule of the Antichrist. He does not rule the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. You don't know who he is the first 3.5 years. Anybody that says they know who he is cannot be telling you the truth. Because it says in 2 Thessalonians 2 that only when he commits the abomination of desolation in the temple that he will be revealed. Okay? That's what tells you who he is. That's why he's the little inconspicuous horn that then becomes the great horn, the big horn, the Antichrist. All right? So that last 3.5 years, Jesus calls it a very interesting thing. Turn to Matthew 24. Jesus talks about this. Matthew 24, and look at verse 21. By Jesus' own words, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor shall ever be again. So, there's going to be, the first 3.5 years will be a tribulation, but the last 3.5 years will be the great tribulation. Okay? All right. Okay, so, Christ, of course, returns to the earth, and Antichrist's rule ends. The heavenly judge intervenes, and the Son of Man begins his 1,000-year reign of justice on the earth. And of course, it will be administered, we're told, by the saints. Now, I want to show you something that I think is often overlooked to conclude tonight. And that's, I want you to turn to Luke 19. If you're already in Matthew, it should be simple to go to your right to Luke 19. Now, there's two parables that are parallel to each other that Jesus gives, but they're not identical. They're similar, but they're not identical. The first one in Gospel Matthew we call the parable of the talents. But the second parable, which is a little different, if you read the two, I should have probably done that, but if you read the two, the second parable is called the parable of the minas, which is another type of money. So I want you to read, we're going to read in starting in verse 11. And while they were listening to these things, he went on to tell a parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and they supposed that the kingdom of God was going to appear immediately. They were had their timing off there a little bit, okay? And he said, therefore, a certain nobleman went to a distant country to receive a kingdom for himself, and then return. And he called 10 of his slaves and gave them 10 minas, and said to them, do business with this until I come back. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we don't want this man to reign over us. And it came about that when he did return, after receiving the kingdom, he ordered that these slaves to whom he had given the money, be called to him in order that he might know what business they've done. You see this interesting parallel? This man owns this kingdom, okay? But the citizens tell him to get out. They don't want him. Okay? So he leaves. But then he comes back later. The first coming, the second coming, Christ, okay? And then the second coming, he has endowed people, these people, with money, and he wants to know what they've done with it. Okay? Verse 16, and the first one appeared and said, Master, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to him, well done, good slave, because you've been faithful in a little thing, be in authority over 10 cities. And the second came and said, your mina master has made 5 minas. And he said to him also, you're to be over 5 cities. Another came saying, Master, behold your mina, I have kept and put away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you because you're an exacting man, and of course, he was the one that did get a reward. Now, why do you suppose he says your reward is 10 cities? To the other one, 5 cities. Remember, this is after he has left and come back in the parable. In other words, it's at his second coming.
Is that in the 1,000 reign, or the 1,000-year reign?
If you're faithful, you're going to administer cities.
Oh, you also like cities.
Well, there's going to be cities all over the earth, right? And what did we read about the saints? The saints will inherit the earth. They'll inherit the kingdom. They'll co-reign with him. The saints,
Judge fallen angels.
right, eventually, finally. So the point is, this is the parable where he says, if you do well in your life, okay, especially those towards the end in this terrible time, then you're going to be in charge of cities. You'll be this is how you'll administrate. Some of you will administrate 10 of them. Some of you will administrate 5 of them. It's really interesting how he puts this parable, isn't it? In the parable of talents, he's talking about a talent of money, and of course his reward is, well done for making awards. Enter into your the joy of your master. But here he says something very different. Okay, it's quite interesting. We often read these things, but we don't pay attention to what we're reading. Now, at the very end, to finish this off in Daniel, look at what Daniel says. Verse 28, and at this point the revelation ended, and as for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale. Now, I think that's an understatement. What Daniel has just been shown is absolutely shocking to him. It's exhausting to him. We'll see actually in chapter 8 when he's shown another vision that, again, it just absolutely wipes him out. The experience of doing it. I mean, we can almost not imagine what he is seeing, okay, what he's experiencing. Literally, heaven is being pulled back and he's being shown other dimensions and elements of the earth, Be quite a trip to take. So, all right, that's the 7th chapter. And that's a critical chapter because the rest of the book hangs on what you just read in chapter 7 and fills in a whole lot more details. Questions? Yes, Jeff.
This is during the tribulation period. Usually it's taught, supposedly, in Genesis 7, that the tribulation isn't going to start until the temple is rebuilt. Now, they can do it very quickly, I understand. But that starts the 7-year period. And the first 3.5 years will be great because the Antichrist will actually kind of be in charge of it.
Well,
that's what I always understood.
we'll read in chapter 9 that if I remember correctly, and we'll read it when we get there, that what really begins the 7-year period is a treaty. Okay? A peace treaty.
Yeah.
And what's the obvious problem? It's the problem that's been going on since Esau and Jacob, okay? That is the problem between the Jews and the Arabs, okay? And a treaty is negotiated by apparently the Antichrist that solves this problem.
But it really won't start until the tree or whatever
Right.
is done.
Yeah. But
then
it's,
the temple will be rebuilt.
the temple has to be there by the 3.5-year mark.
Yeah.
That's the only thing we can say. It has to be there by then. And of course, you get into all these interesting discussions of the archaeological work in Israel now, where some people are questioning if what has been the traditional Temple Mount was actually the site of Solomon's temple. Some people believe, based on what they're excavating, that it actually was sitting in the city of David, which is about 800 or 1,000 yards to the south.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know exactly yet, but there are some kind of provocative excavations going on archaeologically now about that. Hopefully they'll know more here pretty soon.
Well, but the White House Wall, excuse me, was part of the Temple Mount.
Well, it was part of a mount.
Yeah.
It
They
is,
thought it was the part of the temple.
they concluded that that's where what was left, and therefore it became sacred to go to the Western Wall, et cetera, but we'll have to see how this pans out, the archaeology on this, but if they would be right, and it did exist in the city of David, you know, it opens up a whole lot of very interesting possibilities about building a new temple.
Yeah, because
It's not
they
in,
do it sooner.
it's not in a zone that would create absolute mayhem.
Right.
If they tried doing a Temple Mount,
It's
look out.
Yeah, man.
So, yes, Michael.
In your opinion, do you think that the temple will be built before the start of the 7-year tribulation?
I don't know. See, the problem is, you know, this is the thing about prophecy. There are certain things we have very specific timing, and some things we don't have timing. You know, we have a very clear timing statement about when will you know who Antichrist is.
When he
Okay.
enters the temple, right.
Very clear.
So
At
the
the
temple will be by the 3.5 years.
Yes.
But how much before?
We don't know. It's just like the problem, of course, that we have with all the theories and the positions about the rapture. When's it going to occur? There's no statement about when it's going to occur exactly. There's no timing that is said about the rapture. Okay? Some things are exact timing. We're going to read the most exact prophecy about timing in the entire Bible in I'll say a few weeks. Maybe a few weeks. And that's chapter 9. It is the most, it is precise to the day. But some things have that level of timing and some things don't have timing statements. Yes.
I really think that in 2025, because it's going to be a very important date because of the Wycliffe of Campus Crusade. Their goal is to have the word out throughout the world by 2025.
Yeah.
And they're doing it at a very quickly pace
That's it.
because of electronics.
Mhm.
It also ties in with the Deagle prediction.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deagle.com. All right, Michael, would you end this with prayer?
Sure.
All right.
Heavenly Father, again, we're in your debt. We know that your 1,000-year reign will be something to behold, and to move from where we are on the earth to you being in control of the 1,000 years. What a glorious time that will be on the face.
Mm.
And I'm excited through your word to know that this is going to take place. And I just want to thank you, Lord, for revealing this to us, that we know now where we will be in that 1,000 years. So thank you, Lord, for illuminating our minds and controlling our spirits in a manner that we can appreciate, follow, and love. So thank you, Lord, again for your help. Thank you, Lord, for this time together to enlighten our minds, to quiet our souls, Lord. Amen.
Amen.